It was supposed to be just another quiet evening. Hannah Brooks had spent years tucked away among dusty shelves and forgotten stories, believing her life would never stretch beyond the worn walls of the town's crumbling library. But that night, when she opened the heavy doors to let in the storm and a stranger, she unknowingly stepped into a mystery decades in the making. A hidden letter, a forgotten promise, and a man who would change everything she thought she knew about her past and her future. What began as a simple act of kindness would soon unravel secrets long buried, awaken dreams she thought she'd lost, and lead her toward a life she never dared to imagine. Before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from. Enjoy the story, everyone. The rain hit the cracked sidewalk in a steady, cold rhythm as Hannah Brooks balanced a precarious stack of books against her hip, fumbling with the keys to the old library's heavy oak doors. Her coat was soaked through at the shoulders, her boots splashing in shallow puddles that mirrored the dim streetlights overhead. Most people had long since taken shelter, their homes lit warm and golden behind closed curtains, but Hannah stayed behind as she always did, to close up the library, to make sure the old place felt a little less abandoned. It was her small rebellion against the world that seemed to have forgotten about dusty buildings, forgotten places, and people like her. The lock gave way with a protesting groan, and she nudged the door open with her shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of paper, wood polish, and something faintly floral from the potpourri Mrs. Landry had left in the entryway months ago. The library was a cavern of shadows and whispers now, the storm pressing against the tall windows, wind rattling the frames like ghostly fingers. Hannah set the books down on the front desk and peeled off her dripping coat. Her fingers, stiff from the cold, moved automatically through the closing routine, lights off in the children's section, thermostat adjusted, computers shut down. She was halfway to the back room when she heard it, the sharp, clear knock at the door. She froze. No one ever came to the library this late, especially not during a storm. A second knock followed, insistent but not harsh. Hannah hesitated, heart hammering a little too fast. Logic said it was probably someone looking for shelter, maybe a lost traveler. Her gut warned her to be careful. Drawing a breath, she returned to the entrance and peered through the rain-blurred glass. A man stood there, shoulders hunched against the downpour, his figure obscured by the night. He wore a dark jacket, the hood pulled low, and one hand pressed something, a folder, tight against his chest to shield it from the rain. Against better judgment but guided by something deeper, a sense of responsibility, maybe, or the simple stubborn kindness that had always ruled her, Hannah unlocked the door and pulled it open a crack. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice steady but cautious. The man pushed back his hood, revealing a mess of rain-slicked dark hair and piercing gray eyes. His features were sharp, striking even in the weak light. He looked tired, soaked to the bone, but when he spoke, his voice was calm, almost apologetic. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said. I was hoping someone would be here. I need to ask about a book." Hannah blinked. "A book? At this hour?" She opened the door a little wider, stepping back to let him inside. The man hesitated for only a moment before stepping into the warmth, shaking rain from his jacket like a half-drowned dog. Up close, he was tall, taller than she'd first thought, and carried himself with a kind of tense, controlled energy as if he wasn't used to asking for help. "You're lucky," she said lightly, trying to ease the heavy tension that hung between them. "We usually close an hour ago. I was just finishing up." "Then I'm luckier than I deserve," he said with a wry smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He clutched the folder tighter, and Hannah noticed for the first time that his hands were trembling slightly from the cold or something else, she couldn't tell. "What kind of book are you looking for?" she asked, moving back toward the front desk where an ancient computer hummed quietly. He followed, scanning the library with a glance that was both restless and searching. "I'm not sure exactly," he admitted. "It's an old one, from the town's early days. My grandfather mentioned it in a letter, something about a ledger or a journal kept here decades ago. Records about the town's founders." Hannah's brows lifted in surprise. Few people cared about that kind of thing anymore. The town's history was buried in yellowed newspaper clippings, scattered museum plaques, and half-forgotten stories told at the local diner. "You might be thinking of the Carter collection," she said, motioning toward the far corner of the library. "It's mostly boxed up. No one's touched it in years." "Carter," he repeated, his voice tight with something she couldn't name. "Yeah," Hannah said. "Old family. Used to own half the town. Most of them moved away or—" She shrugged. "Time happens." The man's mouth quirked into something that might have been a smile or might have been a grimace. He shifted the folder under his arm. It was old, Hannah realized now, the edges worn, the paper inside yellowed. Not a legal file, not anything recent. Come on, she said, beckoning him. I'll show you. They crossed the dim main floor, their footsteps echoing off high ceilings. Rain lashed the windows in bursts, the storm outside growing fiercer. Hannah led him through a maze of shelves to the farthest alcove, where a series of battered metal filing cabinets stood against the wall like forgotten sentinels. The Carter collection's in here, she said, pulling open a squeaky drawer. Dust motes danced in the faint light. Inside were old ledgers, handwritten journals, family records, layers of memory packed away and ignored. The man stared at the papers as if they held the answers to questions he hadn't yet learned to ask. You're welcome to look through them, Hannah offered. I've got some work to finish up. Take your time. He nodded absently, already reaching for one of the old ledgers, flipping carefully through the brittle pages. Hannah lingered for a moment, curiosity prickling at her, but then forced herself to turn away. It wasn't her business. Whoever he was, whatever he was looking for, it didn't concern her. At least that's what she told herself. She was halfway back to the front desk when a sharp exclamation made her spin around. Wait, he called. There's something. Hannah hurried back, heart ticking faster. The man held out a faded envelope, the seal broken but the paper surprisingly intact. His fingers were steady now, purposeful. Inside the envelope was a letter handwritten in looping cursive, dated over 50 years ago. And it was signed by two names, one she recognized immediately. Margaret Brooks. Her grandmother. Hannah's breath caught. Beside it, another name. James Carter. A name that still carried weight in the town's rusted veins. She lifted her gaze to the man standing before her, realization dawning like a slow, spreading fire. You're a Carter, she whispered. The man gave a tight nod. Evan Mercer, he said, voice low. Carter was my mother's name. And with that simple exchange, Hannah Brooks understood deep in her bones that nothing about her quiet life would ever be the same again. The library seemed to shrink around them, the storm outside forgotten as Hannah stared down at the fragile letter in her hands. The ink was faded but still legible, the words looping across the page with a tenderness that felt almost sacred. It wasn't just a casual note. It was a promise. I don't understand, Hannah said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked up at Evan, who stood rigid, rainwater still dripping from the ends of his dark hair. Why would your family and mine? Evan's mouth tightened. He looked away, scanning the dusty shelves, the old carpet frayed at the edges, the worn wooden beams that groaned softly in the wind. It was a long moment before he spoke. I didn't know either, he said. Until a few weeks ago. He pulled the folder open and slid out a second sheet of paper, a photocopy, crisper, official-looking. It was a legal document, Hannah realized, her eyes scanning quickly, property deeds, ownership transfers, trusteeship clauses buried under paragraphs of dense text. At the bottom, two signatures again, Margaret Brooks and James Carter. My grandfather. Evan said slowly, left behind a mess. Half-finished projects. Forgotten promises. He built an empire and abandoned the roots. His voice was calm, but Hannah caught the flicker of old resentment behind his words. This library, Evan continued, tapping the paper lightly, was meant to stay in the care of both families. Protected. Funded. It wasn't supposed to fall apart. Hannah shook her head in disbelief. But it did fall apart. The funding dried up years ago. The town barely acknowledges we exist anymore. I know, Evan said. That's why I'm here? Another rumble of thunder rolled over the mountains. Hannah crossed her arms, hugging herself against a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the storm. So what happens now? She asked. Evan hesitated. His gaze drifted to the cracked ceiling, the leaking window frames, the battered tables. The decay was impossible to ignore. I have the authority, he said slowly, to either reinvest and restore or to sell. The words dropped like stones between them. Hannah's heart stumbled in her chest. You mean it? I could close it down, Evan said, voice grim. Permanently. The thought hit her like a slap. She could already see it, bulldozers for sale, signs, a glassy convenience store rising where the library once stood. Another piece of history paved over for profit. But that's not why you're here, is it? She asked quietly. Evan met her gaze, and for the first time she saw uncertainty there, a man caught between duty and something he hadn't expected to feel. I don't know, he admitted. I didn't plan to care about any of this. I was supposed to check the property, make a decision, move on. And now? And now, he said, raking a hand through his hair, I meet someone like you. Someone who hasn't walked away. The admission settled heavily between them. Hannah lowered her arms, breathing through the whirl of emotion tightening her chest. You don't have to make a decision tonight, she said. Come back tomorrow. See it in the light. Meet the people who still use this place, even if it's falling apart. Evan nodded slowly, the lines in his face easing just a fraction. I'll think about it, he promised. Hannah smiled, small, uncertain, but real. Good. Another gust of wind rattled the windows, and somewhere deep in the building, a door creaked open with a mournful whine. Hannah suppressed a shiver. You probably don't want to drive in this, she said, glancing at the sheets of rain now cascading against the glass. Evan shrugged. I've been through worse. Still, he made no move to leave. There was something oddly comforting about the two of them standing there, surrounded by the smell of damp paper and old wood, an entire forgotten world pressing in around them. Hannah realized, with a jolt, how long it had been since she had shared space with someone like this, with no masks, no expectations, just the fragile, awkward beginnings of understanding. You can stay a while if you want, she said before she could second-guess herself. Until the worst of it passes. Evan's smile was quick and grateful. Thanks. She led him back toward the small reading nook near the center of the library, a circle of mismatched armchairs arranged around a battered coffee table. I'll make some tea, Hannah offered, heading toward the tiny break room tucked behind the archives. She filled the kettle, the old pipes groaning, and glanced through the doorway where Evan stood, inspecting the shelves. He moved carefully, respectfully, his fingers trailing lightly over the worn spines as if each book mattered. It stirred something deep inside her, something fragile and unexpected. When she returned with 2 steaming mugs, Evan had settled into the largest armchair, the folder open on his lap. Hannah passed him a cup and lowered herself into the chair opposite. For a few minutes, they drank in silence, the storm wrapping the library in a cocoon of sound. The low thrum of rain, the occasional crack of thunder, the whisper of wind threading through the eaves. Tell me about her, Evan said suddenly. Hannah blinked. Who? Your grandmother. Margaret Brooks. She hesitated, cradling her mug between chilled fingers. She was... Hannah began, searching for the right words. Fierce. Not in a loud way, she wasn't the type to shout or storm out of rooms. But she loved this place. She believed libraries were the last sacred spaces left. Evan listened intently, his gray eyes fixed on hers. She raised me after my parents. Hannah trailed off, then pressed on. After they left, she taught me how to read by tracing the letters on old encyclopedias. She made me believe that even when the world didn't see you, stories could. A lump rose in her throat, but she swallowed it down. And when she got sick, Hannah said, voice barely audible, I promised I'd keep the library alive. For her. Evan leaned back, studying her with a gravity that made her want to squirm and stay all at once. You've been carrying it alone, he said. Hannah gave a small, helpless shrug. I guess. He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, so softly she almost missed it. You shouldn't have to. The simplicity of it cracked something inside her. No one had ever said that before. Not the town officials who cut funding year after year. Not the friends who drifted away chasing bigger dreams. Not even the regulars who still trickled in, grateful but forgetful. The kettle clicked loudly in the background as it cooled, but Hannah barely heard it over the sudden pounding of her heart. She didn't know this man. Not really. But somehow in the dim light and the steady roar of rain, it felt like he saw straight through her. And it terrified her. And it thrilled her. Before she could find a reply, Evan set his empty mug down and rose to his feet. I'll come back tomorrow, he said. And the day after. However long it takes. Hannah stood too, the letter still clutched in her hand like a lifeline. I'll be here, she said simply. Their eyes met across the battered coffee table, an invisible bridge forming between them, tentative and unsteady, but real. Evan's smile was the last thing she saw before the door swung open and the storm swallowed him whole. Hannah locked the door behind him and leaned her forehead against the cool glass, watching his figure disappear into the sheets of rain. For the first time in a long, long while, hope flickered quietly in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, the library wasn't the only thing that could be saved. The next morning dawned heavy and gray, the storm clouds clinging stubbornly to the horizon. Hannah sat behind the front desk of the library, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee and pretending to focus on inventory sheets she had already reviewed twice. She kept glancing toward the door. She told herself she wasn't waiting. She told herself it didn't matter if Evan came back or not. But when the bell above the entrance finally jingled and he stepped inside, hair damp from misting rain, hands jammed in the pockets of his worn jacket, something inside her relaxed, as if she'd been holding her breath without knowing it. Morning, he said, his voice rough from the cold air. Morning, Hannah replied. setting down her coffee so quickly it sloshed onto the desk. Evan grinned slightly and walked further in, shaking raindrops from his sleeves. He looked less tense today, she noticed. Less like a man carrying the weight of too many expectations. I thought maybe you'd reconsidered, she said, trying to sound casual. I did, he admitted. And I decided I still don't know what I'm doing. Hannah laughed, the sound surprising both of them. That makes two of us, she said. For a moment, they just stood there, the dusty air between them buzzing with unspoken things. Where should we start? Evan asked. Hannah motioned toward the Carter collection, still piled haphazardly in the back corner. There's more where that letter came from. If we dig deep enough, we might even find the roof's original blueprints. Ambitious, he said, raising an eyebrow. You have no idea, she said with a grin. They spent the next hour side by side, sifting through brittle documents and crumbling ledgers, the dust thick enough to make them sneeze. Hannah tried not to notice how Evan's sleeve brushed hers sometimes, or how he smiled at her little muttered curses when a drawer jammed. It was strangely easy working with him, comfortable in a way that made her chest ache a little. As she pulled out another battered ledger, something fluttered to the floor. A scrap of paper folded into a neat triangle. Curious, Hannah bent down and picked it up. The paper was yellowed with age, the ink faded almost to invisibility, but she could still make out a few words. If ever lost, look where the roots grow deepest. She frowned, turning it over. No signature. No date. Just the cryptic sentence. Evan peered over her shoulder. What's that? Some kind of clue, maybe, she said slowly. Or just someone being poetic. Let's assume it's a clue, Evan said. Where would the roots grow deepest around here? Hannah thought for a moment. The old archives, she said finally. The basement. That's where they kept all the town's original records. Births, deaths, land deeds. Evan looked skeptical. Isn't that place sealed off? Mostly, Hannah admitted. After the flood a few years back, the stairs got damaged. But there's still a way in through the maintenance hatch. He gave her a sideways look. You seem awfully familiar with secret entrances. She shrugged. Occupational hazard. And before she could talk herself out of it, she was grabbing a flashlight from behind the desk and leading him toward the back hallway. The hatch was tucked behind a bookcase labeled Travel and Geography, a rusted metal door set low in the wall, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. Hannah knelt and worked the latch loose with a grunt. You sure about this? Evan asked, crouching beside her. Nope, she said cheerfully. But when has that ever stopped me? With a final heave, the hatch swung open, revealing a steep, narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air that rushed out smelled of damp stone and old secrets. Hannah clicked on the flashlight, the beam slicing through the gloom. After you, Evan said, his voice half teasing, half serious. She shot him a look but started down carefully, one hand trailing along the rough wall for balance. The basement was colder than she remembered, the stone walls weeping moisture, the floor uneven and cracked. Shelves lined the narrow aisles, sagging under the weight of forgotten ledgers, rolled maps, and battered tin boxes. Charming, Evan muttered behind her. Welcome to paradise, she said dryly. They moved slowly, scanning the shelves with the flashlight's thin beam. Dust coated everything in a thick, undisturbed layer. It felt like stepping into a tomb, a place time had tried and failed to erase. There, Evan said suddenly, pointing. At the far end of the room, half hidden behind a toppled cabinet, stood a heavy wooden chest. Unlike everything else, it looked tended, as if someone long ago had cared enough to preserve it. Hannah hurried over, heart pounding. The chest wasn't locked. The clasp, though tarnished, yielded easily under her fingers. Inside, wrapped in layers of oilcloth, were a handful of old journals bound in cracked leather and something else. A small, velvet-lined box. Hannah lifted it out carefully and opened it. Inside was a gold pocket watch, the face cracked but still ticking faintly against all odds. And tucked beneath it, another letter. This one addressed to the future caretakers of Silver Creek's memory. Evan whistled softly. That's dramatic. Hannah smiled despite herself, unfolding the letter. The handwriting was familiar. Margaret Brooks again. If you are reading this, then perhaps you have chosen to remember. This library was never meant to be just a building. It is the heart of a promise stitched into the bones of this town. Protect it, and you protect more than bricks and books. You protect the hope that stories and the people who live them matter. She swallowed hard, blinking back sudden tears. This was their legacy, Hannah said thickly. Our grandparents, they weren't just partners in land or money. They believed in something bigger. Evan was silent for a long moment, his hand resting lightly on the chest's edge. I think I'm starting to understand why you stayed, he said quietly. Hannah smiled through the burning in her throat. I didn't know what else to do, she admitted. So I stayed. Maybe, Evan said, meeting her eyes across the beam of the flashlight, you stayed because someone had to. The words sank deep, hitting places she hadn't let herself acknowledge for years. Places that ached with loneliness and longing, and now a flicker of something dangerously close to hope. The days that followed blurred together in a strange kind of rhythm, like chapters flipping faster and faster through a book neither Hannah nor Evan had planned to write together. Each morning, Evan would show up at the library, his sleeves rolled up and a determined look in his eyes, carrying coffee from the corner diner and whatever stubborn energy he had left after endless phone calls and meetings. Each afternoon, they would sift through the archives, tracing the town's history one brittle page at a time, piecing together the forgotten promises that had once meant something to people long gone. And each evening, long after the last visitors trickled out and the closed sign swung gently on the door, they sat side by side in the reading nook, maps and journals spread between them, slowly untangling the past and each other. Hannah tried not to think too much about how natural it felt. About how, without meaning to, Evan had started memorizing how she took her coffee, 2 sugars, no cream, or how he always carried an extra pen because he noticed she kept losing hers. She tried not to wonder what it meant when their hands brushed across the table and neither of them pulled away. Or when he laughed, really laughed, and it sounded like something precious cracking open inside her. But she wasn't blind. And she wasn't immune. Whatever was growing between them was real. It scared her more than she wanted to admit. Because nothing in her life had ever lasted. And deep down, a small, cynical part of her whispered that this wouldn't either. The first real sign of trouble came on a Thursday afternoon, just as Hannah was shelving a batch of returned books. The heavy oak door swung open with a jarring clang, and a woman in a sharply tailored suit strode in, heels clicking on the worn wooden floor. Her blonde hair was twisted into a severe knot at the nape of her neck, and she carried a leather portfolio under one arm like a weapon. "Excuse me," she called crisply, spotting Hannah behind the desk. "I'm looking for whoever's in charge." Hannah set the books down carefully. "That would be me," she said, smoothing her apron instinctively. The woman's smile was tight, professional. "Rebecca Langston, Town Council Legal Advisor." Alarm bells rang in Hannah's head, but she forced a polite smile. "How can I help you?" Rebecca extracted a stack of papers from her portfolio and laid them on the counter. "I'm here regarding the status of this property," she said briskly. "Specifically, its pending sale." Hannah's heart stumbled. "Sale?" she echoed. Rebecca nodded. "The council has received an offer from a private developer. Very generous. They're eager to finalize." But Hannah sputtered. "They can't just sell it. There's a trusteeship agreement. There are records of—" "We're aware," Rebecca said, her tone dismissive. "However, given the current state of disrepair and the financial burden, it's in the town's best interest to consider alternative uses for the property." Hannah's hands curled into fists against the counter. Alternative uses. As if this place was just a plot of land to be gutted and paved over. As if the lives, the memories, the legacy buried in these walls meant nothing. "I understand your concerns," Rebecca said, her voice oozing practiced sympathy. "But sentiment doesn't pay for maintenance or restoration." She tapped the papers meaningfully. "If the heirs, meaning Mr. Mercer, choose not to contest, the sale will proceed." Evan. Hannah swallowed hard. He had more power in this than she did. And no matter how many late nights they'd spent combing through archives, no matter how many shared smiles or quiet conversations, he was still new here. Still a Carter by blood, tied to a legacy she barely understood. Would he choose the easy road? Would he walk away? Or would he stay? "I'll let him know you stopped by," Hannah said stiffly. Rebecca's smile sharpened. "Please do." She gathered her portfolio and swept out, leaving a chill in her wake that no amount of radiator heat could chase away. Evan found her an hour later in the back room, sitting cross-legged on the floor with papers scattered around her like a protective wall. He knelt beside her without a word and handed her a fresh cup of coffee. She accepted it mechanically, wrapping her hands around the warmth even though her fingers shook. "They want to sell it," she said flatly, staring at the floor. "Developers. Condos, probably. Maybe a strip mall." Evan was silent. She glanced at him, her throat tight. "And you can stop it. If you want to." He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "I know," he said. For a long, aching moment, Hannah waited. Waited for him to say he would. Waited for him to promise. But he didn't. "I need to think." he said instead, standing abruptly. I need to figure out what's really right here. Her chest caved inward, a quiet implosion of hope. Right? She said, forcing a smile. Of course. Without another word, Evan left the room, the door swinging shut behind him with a soft click. Hannah sat there alone, the silence pressing down like a physical weight. She told herself she had no right to expect anything from him. He didn't owe her loyalty. He didn't owe her this place. But still it hurt, because for the first time in a long, long while, she had started to believe in something again. And now it felt like that fragile belief was slipping through her fingers like dust. That night, as the rain returned and drummed against her apartment windows, Hannah sat cross-legged on her worn couch, the old letter from her grandmother spread across her knees. Protect it. Not just the building, the hope it holds. The words blurred and sharpened as tears welled in her eyes. She remembered the nights spent curled up in the library as a child, tracing the spines of books with tiny fingers. She remembered the stories that had carried her through loneliness, grief, uncertainty. And she remembered the promise she had made, not just to Margaret Brooks, but to herself. She would fight, even if she had to do it alone, even if her heart broke again. She would not let them erase this place without a fight, because some stories deserved to be remembered, and some roots ran too deep to be torn out. The next morning, the town of Silver Creek was bathed in a watery, reluctant light. Puddles shimmered in the streets, and the smell of wet earth clung to the air. Hannah arrived at the library early, long before the official opening hours, her keys jingling nervously in her pocket. She wasn't sure what she was expecting. Maybe another confrontation with council representatives, or a notice taped to the door. Maybe Evan waiting there with an answer she didn't want to hear. Instead, she found only silence and the comforting creak of the old building settling around her, as if the library itself was taking a slow, deep breath. She flipped the closed sign to open anyway. A small act of defiance. A whisper to the world that she wasn't giving up. Not yet. Not ever. The morning dragged on. A few regulars wandered in, Mrs. Carter from the bakery, two elderly men who played chess on rainy Thursdays, but Hannah barely registered them. She kept glancing toward the door, the minutes crawling by slower than molasses in January. Evan didn't come. By noon, she was ready to tear her hair out. She told herself he was busy. She told herself she didn't care. She told herself a lot of things she didn't believe. It wasn't until nearly 2 o'clock, just as she was restocking the battered mystery section, that the bell above the door jingled again. She turned, heart-lurching, and froze. It wasn't Evan. It was Rebecca Langston. And this time she wasn't alone. 2 men in suits flanked her, both carrying clipboards and wearing the grim expressions of people who measured life in square footage and profit margins. Hannah set the books down carefully and walked toward them, every muscle in her body tense. "Good afternoon," Rebecca said, her smile razor-sharp. "We're here to conduct a preliminary evaluation. Standard procedure before property transfer." "I didn't agree to any evaluation," Hannah said, keeping her voice level. Rebecca's smile widened slightly. "You're not required to. The property belongs to the trust, and with one of the heirs present in town." She paused meaningfully. "Mr. Mercer?" Hannah asked, her throat dry. Rebecca only smiled, like a cat who had already swallowed the canary. "Let's proceed," she said briskly to the men. They fanned out, measuring walls, photographing shelves, muttering notes into their recorders. Hannah stood rooted to the spot, helpless fury boiling under her skin. This was happening. It was happening now, and Evan had allowed it. She didn't wait for them to finish. Without a word, she grabbed her coat from the hook and marched out the door, the cold air slapping her cheeks as she strode down Main Street. She knew exactly where to find him. The Carter building loomed at the far end of the street, its sleek glass and steel facade a jarring contrast to the town's otherwise quaint, time-worn charm. A monument to a family that had long since abandoned the roots they had once planted here. Hannah pushed through the revolving door and into the polished marble lobby, ignoring the curious glances from the receptionist. "Mr. Mercer," she said tightly. "I need to see him." The receptionist hesitated, clearly unsure whether to stop her. Hannah didn't wait for permission. She spotted Evan stepping out of the elevator, a phone pressed to his ear, his brow furrowed in concentration. When he saw her, his expression shuddered instantly. "I'll call you back," he muttered into the phone, pocketing it hastily. "Hannah." "Don't," she said, cutting him off. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Hannah took a breath that tasted like betrayal and salt. "You let them evaluate it," she said, her voice shaking. "You're letting them sell it." Evan ran a hand over his face, looking suddenly older, wearier. "It's not that simple," he said. "It is to me," she said. "You either fight for something or you don't." His jaw tightened. "You think I don't care? That I don't understand what this place means?" "You don't," she said, voice low and raw. "You might understand history on paper, Evan. You might even understand promises made in ink. But you don't understand what it means to live for something. To believe in it when no one else does. To fight for it even when you're tired and broke and scared." He flinched almost imperceptibly. "I'm trying," he said, quieter now. "You have no idea how hard I'm trying." Hannah shook her head, blinking back the burn behind her eyes. "I don't need you to try," she said. "I needed you to choose." She turned on her heel and walked away before he could see her break. Before he could see the tears she couldn't hold back anymore. That night, the library was colder than usual. Hannah moved through the aisles like a ghost, shelving books no one would check out, straightening tables no one would sit at. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself she had survived worse. But as she locked the front door and leaned her forehead against the cool glass, she couldn't escape the aching hollow Evan had left behind. Some part of her had believed he would be different. Some foolish, desperate part had believed he would fight for her the way she would have fought for him. And now, standing in the dim, empty library with the rain weeping against the windows, she felt that belief collapse under its own weight. Maybe some people were never meant to stay. Maybe roots, no matter how deep, weren't strong enough to hold. Miles away, Evan sat alone in his rented office. The old letter from Margaret Brooks spread out on the desk before him. He had read it so many times now he could recite it from memory. Protect it. Not just the building, the hope it holds. He stared at the words until they blurred. He thought of Hannah's face, pale with fury and heartbreak. He thought of the library, crumbling, fragile, stubborn. He thought of all the easy choices laid out before him, and realized that the only thing harder than choosing to stay was choosing not to. The next morning broke with a pale, uncertain sun pushing through the mist. Hannah stood at the front desk of the library, the closed sign still hanging on the door even though it should have flipped hours ago. She couldn't bear to open the place today. Couldn't bear to see it measured and judged by people who saw only decay, not dreams. She ran her hand over the worn wood of the counter, feeling the deep grooves left by generations of readers. The library had been her sanctuary, her shield, her home, and now it was slipping through her fingers faster than she could hold on. She told herself it was over. But some stubborn part of her, the same part that had refused to give up when the roof leaked, when the funding dried up, when the world seemed to stop caring, still clung to hope. Tiny. Stupid. But alive. Just as she turned away, ready to drown herself in the monotony of reshelving dusty biographies, the bell over the door jingled. She stiffened. Probably Rebecca Langston again, here to finalize the library's obituary. She braced herself, heart hammering against her ribs. But when she looked up, it wasn't Rebecca. It was Evan. And he wasn't alone. Behind him stood a cluster of people, Mrs. Carter from the bakery, the two elderly chess players, a handful of familiar faces from the diner, the grocery store, even the gas station. People who had spent their lives in Silver Creek, who remembered the library not as a relic, but as a lifeline. Hannah's mouth fell open. What is this?" she managed. Evan stepped forward, his expression determined, his hands stuffed deep in the pockets of his worn jacket. "It's a petition," he said simply, "to recognize the library as a historic landmark." He pulled a thick stack of papers from under his arm and placed them on the counter. Over 300 signatures. More coming. Hannah stared at the papers, stunned. "But how?" Evan shrugged, a crooked smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I talked to the people who mattered," he said. "Not the ones in offices. The ones who grew up here, who fell in love here, who learned to read here. The ones who understand that history isn't just something you pave over." He paused, his gaze steady on hers. "I made my choice, Hannah." A lump rose in her throat so quickly she almost couldn't breathe. "I'm not selling it," Evan said, voice rough. "I'm staying. And I'm fighting." The room was spinning slightly, but she forced herself to stay upright, to believe what she was hearing. "You're serious," she whispered. Has a heart attack, he said, grinning. The townsfolk behind him shuffled forward, offering shy smiles and nods of encouragement. Mrs. Carter placed a trembling hand on Hannah's shoulder. You kept it alive when the rest of us forgot, she said softly. Now it's our turn. Hannah blinked hard, tears stinging her eyes. I don't know what to say, she whispered. Say you'll stay, Evan said simply. Say you'll fight with me. She let out a choked laugh, wiping at her eyes. I never planned to do anything else. The days that followed were a blur of movement and hope. Evan threw himself into the preservation project with a ferocity that startled even him. He met with architects, historical consultants, grant writers. He pored over ancient town records with Hannah, uncovering more evidence of the library's foundational role in Silver Creek's early days. The community rallied, spurred by something older and deeper than nostalgia, pride. They held bake sales, book drives, fundraisers at the church hall. Children painted colorful signs proclaiming "Save our library" and taped them in every store window. For the first time in years, the town felt alive. And so did Hannah. One evening, long after the last volunteer had gone home and the paintbrushes from the community cleanup day lay drying on the floor, Hannah and Evan sat side by side on the library steps, their shoulders brushing, their legs stretched out into the cooling night air. They didn't speak at first. Didn't need to. The peace between them was deep, easy, earned. Hannah tilted her head back, watching the stars blink into existence overhead. You didn't have to stay, she said quietly. Evan's arm brushed against hers, deliberate, steady. I didn't want to leave, he said simply. She smiled, small and real. You're not what I expected, she admitted. He chuckled low in his chest. Neither are you. They sat like that for a long time, breathing in the night, the scent of fresh paint, the faint laughter drifting from the diner down the street. Finally, Evan turned, his voice serious. Hannah. She looked at him, heart thudding. I don't want this to be temporary, he said. Not the library. Not us. Her breath caught. I know I'm late, he said. And I know I messed up. But if you're willing to take a risk, I'm willing to fight for more than just a building. He reached for her hand, tentative but sure. Hannah stared at their intertwined fingers, feeling the calluses, the warmth, the steadiness. She thought of her grandmother's letter. She thought of all the nights she had spent alone, convincing herself it was enough to survive when somewhere deep down she had always wanted to live. She squeezed his hand back. I'm tired of being scared, she said simply. A slow, brilliant smile broke across Evan's face. Good, he said, because we have a lot of living to do. Under the silver wash of starlight, surrounded by old bricks and older promises, Hannah Brooks and Evan Mercer began something new. Something messy and real and terrifying. Something worth fighting for. Autumn settled over Silver Creek like a soft, golden blanket. Leaves tumbled down Main Street in lazy spirals, catching in doorways and gathering in piles along the sidewalks. The air smelled of wood smoke, fresh bread from the bakery, and that particular crispness that always made Hannah's heart ache in a good way. The library was still rough around the edges, water stains on the ceiling, cracked floorboards in the northwest corner, but it was alive. People came and went daily now, volunteers hammering, painting, sanding. Children laughing during story hour, teenagers cramming for exams at long-forgotten desks. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And it was theirs. Evan was everywhere. Fixing broken shelves, drafting funding proposals, helping Mrs. Carter haul boxes of donated books up the stairs. And somehow always finding a way to end up beside Hannah. Passing her a cup of coffee just as she started to flag. Brushing a stray curl behind her ear when she bent too close over a dusty ledger. Catching her eye across the reading room with a smile that made her knees weak. It would have been easy to fall headfirst into it. Into him. But Hannah was careful. Guarded. She had spent too many years patching over the cracks in her life to risk another earthquake. And Evan, bless him, seemed to understand that. He didn't rush her. He didn't push. He just stayed. Brick by brick, day by day, they built something fragile and fierce between them. Something Hannah was terrified to name out loud. One chilly Saturday afternoon, the town hosted the first official Library Revival Festival on the grassy patch of land behind the building. Food trucks lined the curb. Local bands played folksy music under strings of fairy lights. Tables sagged under the weight of homemade pies, donated crafts, and raffles for free books. Hannah hovered at the edges, overwhelmed by the sheer number of people who had shown up. It felt surreal, like watching someone else's dream come true. Evan found her leaning against the fence, clutching a paper cup of hot cider. He bumped her shoulder lightly with his own. "You look terrified," he said, grinning. "I am," she admitted. He laughed, low and easy. "You should be proud," he said. All of this is because of you." She shook her head. "It's because people remembered they cared." "They remembered because you never forgot," he said simply. Her throat tightened. Before she could reply, a small hand tugged at her sleeve. She looked down to see Maisie Carter, Mrs. Carter's granddaughter, peering up at her with wide brown eyes. "Miss Hannah," Maisie said solemnly, "we made you something." The little girl thrust a wrinkled piece of construction paper into Hannah's hands. In shaky, colorful crayon letters, it read, "Thank you for saving our stories." Hannah bit her lip, blinking rapidly. She crouched down, smoothing Maisie's hair back from her forehead. "Thank you, sweetheart," she said hoarsely. "That's the best thing anyone's ever given me." Maisie beamed and ran off toward the cupcake table. Hannah stayed there for a moment, clutching the homemade card like a lifeline. When she finally straightened, Evan was watching her with an expression so raw, so full of something she dared not name, that she had to look away. That night, after the last string of fairy lights was packed away and the last folding chair stacked, Hannah stood alone in the library's main room, breathing in the warm, dusty scent of home. Evan appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the street lamps outside. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she replied. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and stopped in front of her. For a moment, they just stood there, the hum of the town falling away. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly. Hannah's heart twisted. "I'm scared," she whispered. He smiled, a slow, aching thing that made her chest hurt. "Me too." And somehow that made it easier. He reached for her then, one hand cupping her cheek, the other resting lightly on her waist, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. She leaned in instead, closing the small, impossible distance between them. When their lips met, it wasn't fireworks. It wasn't thunder. It was something gentler, deeper, like roots sinking into rich, unseen soil. It was a beginning. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Hannah let herself believe in beginnings. The days that followed were filled with small, perfect things. Shared coffee in the mornings, secret smiles across crowded rooms, long, meandering conversations about everything and nothing. It wasn't easy. They fought sometimes over logistics, over stubborn pride, over the simple terror of letting someone else in. But they fought fair, and they fought together. The library continued to grow, not just in books or donations, but in life, in community, in hope. And so did Hannah. Bit by bit, she started to imagine a future that didn't end in loss. A future that looked a lot like fairy lights strung across old brick walls. A future that smelled like paper and ink and fresh cider. A future that sounded like Evan's laughter curling through the stacks. A future where she wasn't alone anymore. The first real cold snap of the season hit Silver Creek hard, sending brittle leaves swirling through the streets and frosting the edges of windows overnight. Hannah pulled her worn sweater tighter around her shoulders as she climbed the library steps the following morning, breath fogging in the crisp air. The town council meeting was scheduled for that night. The meeting where they would decide the library's fate. The weight of it pressed against her chest like a stone all day. She tried to distract herself by sorting new donations, by helping Mrs. Carter plan another book fair, by teaching Maisie how to stack picture books without knocking them over, but the minutes crawled by, thick with dread. Evan stayed close, sensing her nerves without comment. He spent the afternoon repairing a squeaky door hinge, hammering stubbornly at the old brass fixture while Hannah reshelved books nearby. At one point, she caught him watching her, a small, thoughtful smile playing at his mouth. "What?" she asked, self-conscious. He shrugged, setting the hammer down. "Just thinking how right you look here." She rolled her eyes but smiled, warmth blooming in her chest. "And you?" she asked, teasing. "You planning to trade business suits for tool belts permanently?" Evan grinned. "I'm thinking about it." Something in his voice, soft, serious, certain, made her throat tighten. But before she could reply, the front door creaked open and a familiar figure stepped inside. Rebecca Langston. Again. Her suit was impeccable, her expression inscrutable as she crossed the room with measured steps. In her hands, she held a single sheet of paper. The silence that fell was absolute. Hannah set her book down carefully. "Miss Brooks," Rebecca said crisply. "Mr. Mercer. I wanted to deliver this personally." She handed the paper to Hannah. Heart hammering, Hannah scanned the page. It was a notice. Official. Legally binding. Her breath caught. She read it again just to be sure. The town council had voted. The Silver Creek Library was now a registered historical landmark. Protected. Preserved. Safe. Tears blurred Hannah's vision as she looked up dazed. You did it, she whispered to Evan. He shook his head. We did. Rebecca nodded once, sharply. Congratulations, she said. The property is exempt from commercial sale. However, her mouth twitched almost wry. The town will still expect you to maintain it. Hannah laughed wetly. We'll manage. After all, they already had. Rebecca inclined her head and turned to leave, her heels clicking sharply against the worn floorboards. The door swung closed behind her, and for a long, breathless moment, Hannah and Evan simply stood there, staring at each other. Then, as if pulled by some invisible thread, Hannah launched herself across the room and threw her arms around him. Evan caught her easily, lifting her off her feet as she laughed into his shoulder, the sound bright and wild and free. They stood there, spinning slightly, the old library creaking happily around them. They had done it. They had saved it. Together. That evening, after the celebration at the diner wound down and the town's elderly mayor had drunkenly declared Evan an honorary local, Hannah and Evan found themselves once again sitting on the library steps, sipping from a shared thermos of hot chocolate. The town was quiet around them, the stars sharp and clear overhead. For a while, they said nothing, simply soaking in the moment, the victory, the astonishing rightness of it all. Finally, Evan set his cup down and turned to her, his face serious in the moonlight. Hannah, he said quietly. I need to ask you something. She looked at him, heart-thudding. I want to stay, he said. Here. With you. I want to build something real. Not just with the library, with us. He took a deep breath, the cold air steaming between them. I know I come with baggage. I know I'm not always good at this. But if you'll have me, I'm not going anywhere. Hannah blinked hard against the tears that welled up. You're sure? She whispered. Evan smiled. A small, fierce thing that lit up his whole face. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. And just like that, the last wall inside her crumbled. The last fear, the last doubt. She reached for him, pulling him close, and kissed him under the stars. The old library standing silent witness behind them. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a fairy tale. But it was real. And it was enough. More than enough. Over the weeks that followed, they slipped into a new rhythm. Evan moved into a small apartment above the old hardware store, claiming he needed to be closer to the action, but spending most nights at Hannah's anyway. They spent late evenings repainting the children's room, arguing good-naturedly over colors. They hosted trivia nights, poetry readings, used book sales. They lived, messy, joyful, together. And every so often, when the sky was clear and the town was quiet, Hannah would climb the library steps, sit on the topmost one, and look out over Silver Creek. She would think about Margaret Brooks and James Carter and the promises they had made. She would think about the roots they had planted, the ones that had weathered storms and neglect and forgetfulness, and realize that they had held after all. That they had grown into something even stronger. Even better. Even brighter. She would think about Evan, about laughter and arguments and late-night dancing in the aisles, and she would smile. Because the library wasn't just saved. It was reborn. And so was she. 2 years later, on a bright spring afternoon, the Silver Creek Library opened its doors to a line of visitors that stretched all the way down Main Street. The renovations were complete now, new wiring, restored floors, freshly painted walls that somehow managed to feel modern and timeless all at once. Golden light spilled through the tall windows, warming the worn reading tables and rows of shelves packed with books old and new. In the center of the main hall, beneath a polished plaque bearing the names Margaret Brooks and James Carter, Hannah stood with a soft, disbelieving smile curving her lips. She wore a simple blue dress that matched her eyes, her hair pinned loosely back with tiny wildflowers tucked into the strands. Beside her, Evan tightened his grip on her hand, a quiet reassurance that after everything, they were still here. Still together. Still building. The ceremony was simple. The mayor gave a speech talking about resilience and heritage and the importance of remembering where you came from. Maisie Carter, now a bold 8 years old, recited a poem she had written herself, her small voice ringing out across the gathering crowd. Stories don't die even when buildings crumble. Stories live when people remember. The townspeople clapped and cheered, wiping at their eyes and bumping shoulders with neighbors. Afterward, everyone spilled into the library, wandering the aisles, laughing and pointing out favorite corners from their childhoods. Hannah and Evan moved through the crowd slowly, accepting hugs and congratulations and pats on the back. More than once, Hannah caught someone glancing at the simple silver band now glinting on her left hand and smiling. Evan had proposed quietly, one snowy evening 6 months earlier, right there in the reading nook where it all began. No grand speeches. No cameras. Just him, kneeling on the worn carpet, his hand trembling slightly as he asked if she would keep choosing him the way he had chosen her. She had said yes through a rush of tears and laughter, her heart so full she thought it might break. And now here they were. Not perfect, but whole. Later that evening, long after the last guest had wandered home and the sun dipped behind the hills, Hannah and Evan sat together on the library steps, sipping cold lemonade and watching the fireflies spark to life in the grass. The town was quiet again, peaceful. The way it always had been. The way it always would be. Evan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Hannah frowned as he handed it to her. "What's this?" she asked. "Something I found tucked behind the old ledger cabinet last month," he said. "I was saving it for today." Curious, Hannah unfolded the paper. It was another letter. Older even than her grandmother's. The handwriting was shaky but determined. "To those who come after us. Remember that a town is not built of stone or wood or laws. It is built of kindness. Of promises kept. Of hands reaching out in the dark. If you find this, it means you were part of that promise now. Carry it forward." Tears stung Hannah's eyes as she folded the letter carefully and pressed it against her heart. "I think we're doing okay," she whispered. Evan smiled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders and pulling her close. "I think we're doing better than okay," he murmured. They sat there in the fading light, the old library standing strong behind them, the future stretching out before them like a winding, sun-dappled trail. There would be hard days. There would be storms. But they would face them together. Rooted. Steady. Unbreakable. Because some promises didn't just endure, they grew. And some stories didn't end. They simply began again in stronger hands and braver hearts. Just like theirs. Thank you for joining us on this unforgettable journey of resilience, second chances, and love. Hannah Brooks and Evan Mercer showed us that sometimes saving a place is really about saving yourself and that kindness, once planted, grows stronger than stone. If this story touched your heart, made you smile, or reminded you of the quiet power of community, we invite you to share it. Tell your story. Build your roots. Keep the promises that matter. And above all, never stop believing in the magic of second chances.